Hi, friends. I'm your old pal, Papa Dale. Today's topic is the Book of Genesis, Part 2, and the year is 2024. Now, because there are always new viewers, I'll introduce myself. I'm a retired pastor, teacher, theologian, and professor with over 50 years of service to the Lord Jesus Christ. My name is Dale Warren. Professionally, I'm known in my writing, teaching, and lectures as D.A. Warren, but my friends just call me Papa Dale. So you can just call me Papa Dale too. Now you can see the details of my personal testimony, family life, education, and ministry experience on other videos on this playlist. So for now, let's get right into today's topic, which is the Book of Genesis, Part 2. So, the book of Genesis is very foundational to the study of the whole book of the Bible. And we are doing an analytical literary analysis of the book. This is for the JHI, the Jan Hus Institute of Biblical Studies. And this is one of the lectures that is part of the Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Literature degree program. The analytic points discussed in this video include the storyline from Genesis 12 through Genesis 50, the historical and cultural setting, the theological origins, intertextuality, progressive revelation, Hebrew idioms, literature types, and literary devices. And so let's get going right into it. Put on my glasses so I can see a little better. And here we go. We begin with the patriarchal history, beginning with Genesis chapter 12. This section focuses on the lives and narratives of the patriarchs of Israel, highlighting their relationships with God and their families. And it includes Abraham's story, Genesis 12 through 25, God's covenant with Abraham, his journey, the promised land, Canaan, his lineage, descendants, and his legacy, the blessing to the whole world that his life will become. The key events in his life include the binding and near sacrifice of Isaac. Then we get into Isaac's story, Genesis 21 through 27. The life of Isaac is a foreshadow of the sacrifice of Jesus, his marriage to Rebekah, and the birth of his children, Esau and Jacob, the twins. Then we get into Jacob's story, Genesis 25 through 36. The life of Jacob, including his conflict with Esau, his experiences, and his name change to Israel, Jacob's son, and the formation of the 12 tribes are also introduced. And then we get into Joseph's story in Genesis 37 through 50. This is the narrative of Joseph, his rise to power in Egypt, and the eventual migration of Jacob's family to Egypt during a famine. And so the storyline of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, encompasses the ancestral narratives of the Israelite patriarchs. It focuses largely on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. This section of Genesis highlights God's covenant with humanity, the complexities of family dynamics, and the foundations of stories that shape the identity of the Israelite people. Abraham's story begins with Genesis 12 through 25. The narrative starts with God calling Abraham. Later, God changed his name to Abraham, and God called him to leave his homeland for a new land that God would show him. God promised to make him a great nation. And Abraham obeys and journeys to Canaan land, where God establishes a covenant with him. He promises land, Canaan. He promises a lineage, descendants. and God promises a legacy that all people were to be blessed through him. Now, key events in Abraham's life include the miraculous birth of his son Isaac to his wife Sarah after 25 years of waiting, after waiting for the promise to be fulfilled, and despite their old age, Genesis 21:1. It also includes key events of the trials that he faces, such as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, the testing of his faith when God asks him to sacrifice Isaac, his only son. And in a profound demonstration of faith, Abraham is willing to obey, but God intervenes and provides a ram as a substitute for the sacrifice, which strengthens the covenant promise. See Genesis chapter 22. The most dramatic event is when God initiates a profound covenant with Abraham, assuring him of numerous descendants and the land of Canaan. To signify this sacred promise, Abraham prepares a series of animals, cutting them in half and laying the pieces opposite each other. As twilight descends, Abraham falls into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness envelops him. In this vision, God appears as a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, walking through the divided animal pieces. This powerful imagery symbolizes God's presence and commitment, illustrating that he will fulfill his promises to Abraham and his descendants, emphasizing the covenant's importance in biblical history, Genesis 15:17. And then we come to Isaac's story. This we see in Genesis 21 through 27. Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah, and he leads a little bit quieter life compared to the life that his father led. The narrative focuses on his marriage to Rebekah, which is orchestrated through a servant's journey back to Abraham's homeland, and you see this in Genesis 24. Rebekah eventually bears twins, Esau and Jacob, and Esau, the firstborn, is favored by Isaac, while Jacob, the second-born of the twins, is favored by Rebekah, and also favored by God. The rivalry between the brothers grows, culminating in Jacob deceiving Isaac in order to receive the blessing that was meant for the firstborn, for Isaac. This deception leads to an estrangement between the brothers, prompting Jacob to flee to Haran. Here we come to Jacob's story, Genesis 25 through 36. In Haran, Jacob encounters his uncle Laban and falls in love with his cousin Rachel, and he agrees to work for Laban for 7 years for her hand in marriage. However, Laban deceives Jacob by giving him Leah to wife instead of Rachel's, who was Rachel's sister. And you can read about this in Genesis 29. Jacob eventually does marry Rachel as well, resulting in a complex family dynamic among Leah, Rachel, and their maidservants, who collectively, the 4 of them, bear him 12 sons. Founders of the 12 tribes of Israel are these sons. Jacob's life is marked by struggles and transformative encounters. Jacob embarks on a significant and transformative night when he wrestles with a mysterious being all night long. This person is often understood to be an angel or a manifestation of God, called a theophany. This intense struggle represents Jacob's desire for a blessing and his quest for identity. As the night progresses, they're still wrestling. Jacob clings to the figure, refusing to let go, symbolizing his determination and resolve. When dawn finally breaks, the enigmatic figure blesses Jacob renames him Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. This encounter not only marks a pivotal moment in Jacob's life, but also illustrates the themes of perseverance, transformation, and divine interaction within the broader narrative, Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. Then we get to Joseph's story. We see this in Genesis 37 through 50. The focus shifts to Joseph, Jacob's favored son, who is envied by his brothers for his dreams of superiority over them. One of the most dramatic events in the life of Joseph occurs when he is betrayed by his brothers. Jealous of their father's favoritism towards him and his dreams of greatness, the brothers strip him of the colorful coat, the present that Jacob had given him, and then throw him into a pit. Eventually, these brothers sell him to Ishmaelite traders who take him to Egypt. Now, this event sets in motion an entire series of dramatic twists and turns. In Egypt, Joseph is imprisoned at first, but then rises to prominence by God giving him the interpretation to Pharaoh's dreams, Genesis 21. This leads to Joseph's appointment as second in command to Pharaoh during a time of famine. He strategically prepares Egypt by storing grain, and ultimately his brothers come to Egypt seeking food, Genesis 42. Through a series of tests, Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers and forgives them, demonstrating reconciliation and the fulfillment of God's plans despite their initial betrayal. The story concludes with Jacob's family relocating to Egypt, Genesis 47. This highlights the preservation of Israel during a time of unrest and Joseph's eventual death at 110 years old. This narrative encapsulates themes of betrayal, resilience, forgiveness, and God's sovereignty, Genesis 50, verse 20. These interconnected stories illustrate themes of faith, promise, family conflict, and divine sovereignty and providence, and that lays the foundation for the Israelite identity and their relationship with God. This two-part structure, the primordial history expressed in Genesis and the patriarchal history revealed in Genesis, this highlights the themes of creation, covenant, faith, and also the development of the Israelite identity, setting the stage for the narrative that follows in the subsequent books of the Bible. And now we begin to speak of more of the analytical portions, examinations of the book. The book of Genesis lays the foundation for several key theological themes. These themes are essential to the understanding of the Judeo-Christian beliefs. They are summarized by three words: origin, purpose, and destiny. Now, here are some of the more prominent themes and detail. The first theme is creation. Genesis presents the idea that God is the creator of the universe ex nihilo, from nothing, establishing the belief in God's divine power, knowledge, sovereignty, inherent otherness, and the goodness of creation. Theme number 2, humanity and sin. The narrative of Adam and Eve highlights the themes of creation in God's image, man's free will, disobedience, and the nature of sin. The fall introduces the concept of original sin and the subsequent need for redemption. Theme number 3, the covenant. The establishment of covenants, particularly with Adam, Genesis chapter 2, and Noah, Genesis 9, and Abraham, Genesis 15. These covenants underscore God's commitment to humanity. These covenants introduce the concept of special relationships between God and his people, emphasizing promises and obligations, revealing Yahweh's sovereign determination to complete his original plan for humanity. Theme number 4, faith and trust. Characters like Abraham exemplify the importance of faith in God's promises, illustrating themes of trust and obedience despite uncertainty of hardship. Theme number 5, redemption and grace. Stories such as Joseph's, where he forgives his brothers, highlight themes of forgiveness, reconciliation, and the redemptive nature of God's plans. Theme number 6, family and relationships. Genesis explores complicated family dynamics, including sibling rivalry, favoritism, and the importance of family. These narratives often emphasize God's ongoing involvement in human relationships. Theme number 7, judgment and mercy. The accounts of judgment, such as the flood and Sodom and Gomorrah, reflect God's justice while also showcasing his mercy, as seen in the preservation of Noah and the righteous. Theme number 8, identity and calling. The theme of personal as well as communal identity, as well as national identity, emerges through the stories of the patriarchs, especially as God calls individuals to special purposes within his broader divine plan. Theme number 9, divine providence. The narrative of Joseph illustrates the theme of God's providential care, showing how seemingly negative events can lead to greater good, aligning with the divine will. Genesis 50:20. Theme number 10, the nature of God. Various representations of God throughout Genesis, such as Creator, Judge, and Redeemer, contribute to understanding his multifaceted nature and characteristics. Now, these themes reflect foundational beliefs that have influenced theological thought and practice throughout religious history. Let me take a little drink here. Now we get to a literary point called intertextuality. Intertextuality refers to the relationship between texts and how one text can influence another or reference or echo one another, creating a network of meanings. As the first book in a 66-book library, Genesis is the historic and theological foundation for the entire canon, an entire library. As such, it is more frequently referenced than most other books in the Bible. In relationship to the book of Genesis, intertextuality can be examined through several lenses. The first lens of intertextuality would be the cultural context. Genesis is part of a larger narrative of the Hebrew Bible. Shared themes, motifs, and story structures, like the creation story and the flood narrative, highlight intertextual connections that influence its interpretation. Another intertextual connection would be biblical allusions. Genesis contains allusions to other biblical texts. For example, later books of the Bible, such as Exodus, refer back to Genesis regularly, particularly regarding the covenants made with Abraham and the concept of the Promised Land. These connections enrich the understanding of God's relationship and humanity. And then we have intertextuality as it regards the themes and symbolism found in the Bible. Genesis introduces key themes like creation, sin, and redemption, which resonate throughout the entire biblical narrative, all 66 books. The symbolic meanings of figures like Adam, Eve, Noah, and Abraham have been echoed and reinterpreted in later biblical texts, literature, and religious traditions. And then we have the intertextuality of literary techniques. The use of literary devices such as parallelism, repetition, and narrative structure in Genesis can be compared to other works, revealing how storytelling techniques shape meaning and reader engagement across texts. By recognizing intertextuality in Genesis, readers can gain deeper insights into its themes, characters, and theological messages, as well as Genesis' influence on subsequent literature and religious thought. Another literary point is progressive revelation. The doctrine of progressive revelation is fundamental to understanding the literary and theological context of the book of Genesis within the broader narrative of the Bible. Now, this doctrine suggests that God reveals His truth gradually over time, culminating in the person of Jesus Christ and the New Testament writings. Here are several ways this concept affects our understanding of Genesis. Progressive revelation can be seen in the foundational narrative. Genesis sets the stage for understanding God's character, the nature of humanity, and the introduction of sin and its consequences. These foundational themes are developed further in later scriptures, allowing readers to see how God's revelation unfolds throughout history. Progressive revelation. And then we see the covenantal framework. The covenants established in Genesis, such as those with Noah, Abraham, and Jacob, are crucial for understanding the unfolding of God's plan. The meaning and significance of these covenants are deepened as the narrative continues through the Pentateuch and into the historical and prophetic writings. We see progressive revelation in typology and foreshadowing. Many characters and events in Genesis serve as types or foreshadows of greater truths revealed later. For example, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is often seen as a precursor to the sacrifice of Christ. This would be unknown prior to the arrival, death, and resurrection of Christ. Understanding these connections enhances the literary richness and theological depth of Genesis. And speaking of theological depth, progressive revelation touches this as well. As readers progress through the Bible, they often revisit themes and concepts introduced first in Genesis. Themes such as creation, humanity's fall, judgment, and redemption. This layered understanding emphasizes how initial revelations are built upon in later texts. This provides a more profound comprehension of God's plan. Isaiah 28:10, line upon line, precept upon precept. And then progressive relation reveals itself through interpretive context. Understanding the doctrine of progressive revelation encourages readers to view Genesis not in isolation, but as part of a larger biblical narrative. This perspective helps interpret Genesis in light of later revelations about God's nature, His interactions with humanity, and the ultimate redemptive work of Christ. Progressive revelation enriches the literary understanding of Genesis by highlighting its role as a starting point for biblical theology, establishing themes that will resonate throughout God's unfolding history, and emphasizing that each subsequent revelation builds upon the truths first disclosed in this foundational book, the book of Genesis. Another literary feature is the idioms that we find in the Hebrew language. To appreciate Genesis fully, It's essential to understand Hebrew idioms that reflect the cultural and theological context of Genesis. Here are two that add significant meanings to the story. There are literally hundreds of these scattered all throughout the Bible. But the two that we really drill down into are, the first one says, quote, to give one hearts to, end quote. Now this is a Hebrew idiom used in Genesis, and it's a phrase that is often used to express the idea of being highly attentive or fully committed to something. For example, in Genesis 4, 6 through 7, when God speaks to Cain about his anger and jealousy, he says, why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, and it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now, while the idiom itself, to give one hearts to, while the idiom itself is not directly quoted here, the underlying concept of giving one's heart, focusing one's intentions and actions, is emphasized in Cain's situation. This idiom highlights the psychological and emotional engagement of characters in Genesis, suggesting that decisions and moral choices are deeply tied to one's heart and intentions. The surprising element is how this simple phrase encapsulates complex human emotions and moral responsibilities. This encourages readers to consider the weight of their own choices and motivations. Another very surprising Hebrew idiom is spoken by Abraham and later by Jacob. In Genesis 24, 2 through 9, Abraham commands his servant Eleazar to put his hand under the patriarch's thigh to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that he, Eleazar, will not arrange a marriage for Abraham's son Isaac with any Canaanite woman. Similarly, in Genesis 47:29 through 31, the dying patriarch Jacob has his son Joseph swear to him that he will bury Jacob not in Egypt, but alongside Jacob's own parents in the cave of Machpelah. And the oath-taking ritual again calls for putting a hand under the patriarch's thigh. Well, what does this mean? Talmudic tradition takes these verses to indicate that the oath was sworn while the circumcised member of the patriarch was held in the hand, and derives from this interpretation the rule that all Jewish oaths must be sworn while some ritual sacred object is held in a hand. Ordinary people must hold a Torah scroll. Scholars may hold any ritual object. The reason the Talmud requires an oath to be sworn while a ritual object is held is indicated by such sources as Genesis 21:23, where Abraham is required by Abimelech to swear by God or gods here, and Exodus 17:16, where Moses seems to be swearing an oath by the divine throne. The ritual object is supposed to indicate the presence of God at the time of the swearing. Thus, the gravity of the oath is impressed upon the one who swears it. It reminds a person that God is present in this swearing of the oath. Now, similarly, Bible passages cited reference the circumcised member as the sign of the covenant between God and his people, Genesis 17:9 through 14, invoking the divine presence to the oath-taking ritual. Very serious indeed, and not easily forgotten. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant between God and the Hebrew people. Victorian and Puritan influences in the early English Bible translations euphemized these idioms. The historic knowledge contributes to a richer understanding of the narrative, inviting deeper reflection on the characters' experiences and moral dilemmas. This was the swearing of an oath, as I said before, that would not be easily forgotten. Now, there are hundreds more Hebrew idioms, but here are 3 additional, more brief examples. 1, the breath of life, Genesis 2:7. This idiom refers to God's giving life to humanity, emphasizing the divine origin of human existence, especially since the Hebrew word for breath and spirit are the same word, ruach. And another Hebrew idiom is the one that goes to walk with God. See Genesis 5:24. This signifies living in close, obedient relationship with God, as seen in the life of Enoch. And then the third Hebrew idiom that we'll mention is, quote, the seed of the woman, Genesis 3:15. This refers to the promised offspring who will defeat evil, a key messianic prophecy. Now we come to literature types. This literary point speaks in Genesis, and Genesis can be analyzed using it through various literature types. Kind of got that language mixed up, so let me start over. Literature types is the topic of the next section. Genesis can be analyzed through various literature types to uncover its deepest meanings and structural elements. Here are 3 examples from among perhaps a dozen that provide a framework for the understanding of the book. And so what we have following are 3 literature types that the portions of Genesis were written in. The first one is narrative literature. Genesis is rich in narrative literature, telling the stories of key figures such as Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, these stories shape the foundational history of Israel, Genesis 1 through 50. Basically, the whole book of Genesis is predominantly narrative literature. Then another type of literature is covenant literature. The book outlines several covenants. These are specific pieces of literature, and this includes the covenant with Adam, Genesis 3, Noah, Genesis 9, and Abraham, Genesis 12 and 15. These covenants establish God's promises and expectations. They are not only covenant literature, but they are covenant literature that is packed inside the narrative, the overarching narrative literature. And the same could be said of literature type number 3, typology literature. Genesis contains typological elements where characters and events prefigure future realities, such as the sacrificial offering of Isaac, Genesis 22, and this symbolizes the future sacrifice of Christ. And then we have literary devices. 2 significant literary devices that add depth and meaning to the narrative of the book of Genesis are chiasms is one, symbolism is another. And a chiasm is a rhetorical structure where ideas are presented in a symmetrical pattern, often mirroring themes or concepts. An example can be seen in the stories of Jacob and Esau, particularly in Genesis 20, chapter 27 through 33. The narrative reflects a chiastic structure balancing conflict with reconciliation. By mirroring themes of deception and reconciliation, Genesis emphasizes the complexity of their relationship and highlights the themes of family dynamics, forgiveness, and transformation. This device encourages readers to see connections between characters and events, deepening the understanding of their journeys and overarching narrative of God's promise. And then we have the literary device of symbolism. Genesis is rich with symbols that convey deeper meanings. For example, the tree of knowledge of good and evil in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. This symbolizes the human choice and the moral dilemmas that come with free will. The act of eating from the tree represents disobedience and the loss of innocence, serving as a catalyst for the narrative of sin and redemption that unfolds throughout Genesis and the Bible. This symbolism invites readers to reflect on the implications of choices and the human condition, making the story relevant across generations, even for us today. Both chiasms and symbolism are essential literary devices that enhance the thematic richness and emotional impact on the narratives in Genesis. This encourages deeper reflection on the human experience and divine interaction. Genesis utilizes hundreds of additional literary devices to convey its messages with depth and clarity. These devices enhance the narrative and thematic impact of the book. Here are 4 more. 1. Hyperbole. The Tower of Babel in Genesis 11:4. The builders say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens." Now, this statement exaggerates the ambition of humanity, suggesting that they can construct a tower that actually physically reaches the heavens, highlighting their desire to make a name for themselves and challenge divine authority. And then you have literary device of metaphor. Metaphors in Genesis, such as comparing God's promises to the number of stars in the sky, Genesis 15:5. This illustrates an abstract concept through concrete imagery. Then we have the literary device of synonymous parallelism. This is where an idea is repeated in different words. This device is employed to emphasize key ideas, such as in the description of God's creation of humanity, Genesis 1:26 through 27. And then we have the literary device of antithetical parallelism. This is the repeating of the opposite of an idea in several ways. And contrasts are used to highlight differences, such as between the righteous and the wicked in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. And so this ends part number 2, Genesis part number 2 of the 3 parts of the book of Genesis. So, I'm your old pal, Papa Dale, and this is the year 2024. The lecture you just watched is part 2 of 3 for the book of Genesis. Great insights leading to deeper relationships with Jesus await you in part number 3. So, keep going. Now, please remember to read the printed notes and look up the scripture citations if you are studying for the Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Literature degree. You can find these notes in the video transcript or at the link below. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next video. This is your old pal, Papa Dale, signing off.